camera on. It's really helpful for us on this end, so we appreciate it. We know it doesn't always work, but when it does, it's helpful. So in case you were wondering about where to access materials today, you would do that from our website, midwestpbis.org. You've already started working in your chat. When you get to midwestpbis.net or midwestpbis.org, you would go to Coaches Network meetings and scroll down, and then on September 14th, today's October 5th, so it's down below, but the PowerPoint will be right there for you. So just in case you're newer to Midwest PBIS Network, we're a hub of the National Center on PBIS, which is the National Technical Assistance Center funded from the U.S. Department of Ed. And our main primary task is to assist state boards of ed in building their capacity and their installation, fidelity, outcomes, and sustainability of PBIS. So that's where our main charge is from the National Center, and we are now partnered out of West 40 this year, so that's new if you're new to us. So this picture is obviously me prior to being in the sun, or really dark hair dye, I don't know which one. Anyway, I am accompanied by my colleagues Diane Lemaster, Katie Pullman, and Tricia Schroed. Would you all like to come up and say hi?
Hi there, welcome. It's good to see a lot of coaches that we know and love, and it's nice to see your faces. We may not be in person, but this is still just the next best thing. So good to see everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're all staying well, and we're looking forward to this afternoon.
And hello, I'm with Diane. Coaches Network meetings in person were my favorite days, 4 days of the year. So virtual monthly is kind of starting to become one of those top days as well. So appreciate you guys being with us.
So today's topic, and I'm going to give you an agenda here in a little bit, but basically the first part of today is going to be about considerations for staff wellness and how to support regulation in the classroom. And it's really going to be about systematizing that. And then the second hour is going to be where you sign up for a TA room, whether you want to be in a tier 1 technical assistance room, a tier 2, or a staff wellness. So you'll be able to sign up for which one you want to go into for the last hour. So when we talk about regulation and staff wellness or staff self-care, whatever you want to call it, to understand the importance of this, you have to first understand brain regulation and how our brain regulation impacts how we react to students and to outside stimuli. So this diagram is from childtrauma.org, which is Bruce Perry's work. And it has us begin to explore where we're functioning from in our brain. So I want you to think of a day where you had a lot personally going on or professionally going on. And I want you to think about that day where there was like a million things happening. So your kids are upset about something, you're trying to get on Zoom at work or get out the door for work. You and your partner have a disagreement about the dishwasher. No one took the trash out. You're like, whatever. You're having a day where everything is flying a lot. So I just want you to start thinking about what part of your brain you are operating out of. So what we know is that our brain develops from the bottom up. In the very bottom of our brain, where our brainstem is what's responsible for survival. The very bottom of your brain is what's in charge of breathing, blinking, swallowing, making your heart beat. And the higher level of your brain, the cortex or neocortex, is where you are able to process and think through things and make rational decisions and not be jumpy and be able to recognize someone else's distress. So when you are having a day, personally or professionally, that feels chaotic, you want to start to assess whether you're functioning from this calm place where you're able to problem solve and think clearly, and also this part of your brain where you're alert, so you can participate in routines and things can be, you can get things lined up as well as, or are you in the part of your brain where everything is on high alert? Or at the bottom part of your brain, which is where fight, flight, and freeze also happen. So where we want to be functioning is from the higher part of our brain. So unless there's some emergency, you don't want to be hanging out in your, there's no such thing as really hanging out. I'm just using that as an example. You don't want to be hanging out, spending all your time in the lower part of your brain, unless we're focused on survival. We want to be focusing, we want to be at the higher level in our brain as much as possible. So when you think about this, think about a student who is acting out and is super impulsive and is refusing to cooperate and is acting hostile. So then if we feel, depending upon where we're functioning from in our brain, if we feel attacked or personally disrespected, then more than likely we are going to act out of that mode, out of that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and we're going to accept the challenge. So what we need to do from here, from the student to the teacher piece, what we need to focus on is how do we make it so that we can see kids' behavior in a way that doesn't feel personal and where we don't accept their challenge. But if we do accept their challenge, then more than likely the student's going to escalate and accept our challenge and become more hostile. And then the teacher's going to feel more threatened and function more out of the lower state of their brain. And it's going to just continue to be this cycle. So our goal in education is to create safe, consistent, predictable environments where we are least likely to activate the stress response system or the fight, flight, or freeze system in students. So our job is to create a safe, consistent, predictable environment so that kids are less likely to be triggered, and so that we're functioning from a place in our brains where when kids are triggered, we aren't taking that personally. So the premise we're functioning from is that we're functioning from a premise that responsible and informed educators are people who are practicing self-care. So there's a million analogies of this, right? The airplane, put your oxygen on first. You can't pour from an empty cup. There's a million different sayings about this. And we want you to know we're just going in with this assumption that you have to know yourself in order to take care of yourself, and you have to know yourself and take care of yourself in order to achieve better outcomes for students. So that's kind of our foundational belief system here as we talk about staff wellness. We know that there's not been a ton of research yet about teacher wellness. There's tons of research about emergency room nurses and other kind of social work clinicians, but in schools, this is a relatively new conversation. We also know that the best thing about being a teacher is that it matters, and the hardest thing is that it matters all the time. Whether you're a teacher or a clinician or a support staff member or an administrator, anybody who's working in this field, no matter what their role is, every moment matters. And that feels like a lot of pressure when we're human beings, right? Just trying to make our way through as best as we can. So Katie already had you do that, and I am just going to point out to you that the objectives in general for our network meetings are that you learn about updates, tools, and new messages, that you get to connect with other people in similar positions, that we provide a little bit of content, and hopefully the content we provide you helps deepen your understanding of said content. And then we're hoping that this models for you as coaches how you could go back and do this with district leaders, or you could talk to district leaders about going back to do this with school-based coaches. So we would really encourage you to use this with school-based coaches, and then make tweaks as you want to. So we're going to talk about systems of self-care. We're going to have breakout rooms, and we're going to report out in a large group. And in the second hour, I mentioned you're going to get to pick which room you want to be in, whether you want to be in tier 1, tier 2, or staff wellness. Or you could also decide, if there are multiple people from your team on this call, you could decide that you want to jump off and go meet as a team virtually or in person. We love it when you share your resources because it helps us learn, it helps everybody else learn, and anytime we can save anybody any work, we're all about that. So if you have materials to share, you could go into Coaches Network, PBIS, MidwestPBIS.org, under Coaches Network meetings, and you're going to see a document here that says shared folder for COVID-19 examples. You can click on it. It will take you to a page that looks like this, which are the instructions for how to add something. And then you'll click on the shared folder, and that's where you can add something. Or you can actually share documents during Zoom through chat. So you would go to chat, you'd go to your chat button, you would select everyone, then you'd click on the file button, and you would select where you want to get your file from. So you can upload it directly into the chat. So the more you can share, the more beneficial the network meetings really are for people. So most of you have probably seen something like this. I would just say that our expectations for today, if we're going to go with responsible, respectful, and committed, responsible would be that we keep our phones or our lines muted if we aren't talking. That we make sure everything is charged and you have all the materials you need. You were all on time, so thank you for that. We can show respect by participating in the conversations and in the breakout rooms. Feel free to use your emojis to raise your hand or come off mute and ask a question. And then committed is just one example of that would be that you follow up with any tasks that you identified for today. So speaking of chat options, here's the mute button if you are newer to that. Here is the start video where you turn your video on and off. The chat button, you can chat with us, the hosts, or with other participants. And if you're chatting with participants and it says privately, know that it is private right now, but it won't be private later. So if you want to comment on my sweater, you might as well just put it in public chat because we're going to read it. So what I'm trying to say is nothing's really private in chat, just so you know. So when you have the screen up, you have the option for your personal screen to see everybody in gallery view or exit in full screen and see speaker view. So those are options for you. I mentioned the participant reactions. So if you click on participants on your screen, then you will have options here, raise your hand, yes, no. And then the more button now has a coffee cup and a clock that says that you've stepped away. We need to make sure that you are named first and last name on your profile picture that is up here, because that's how we're going to get Illinois Education or PDHs to you. So if you would make sure that your full name is on your picture. So in case you need help with that, you can do two things. You can go to the corner, upper right corner of your picture on the video, and there'll be 3 dots. You can click on it there and it will say rename. Or you can go to the participant list, click on your name, right click on your name, and it will let you select to rename yourself. So we need to make sure that you are ready to go. So when you sign in to the webinar and you are posted here with your first and last name, that is going to show the time for your virtual training, and that's going to verify your attendance for any PDHs. Those PDHs will come in a couple of weeks. You'll get an evaluation of our time together, and then you will be able to jump right in, fill out the eval, and then your PDHs will be kicked back to you. Well, I'm going to toss this to Katie, and she's going to just remind or review how we want to have the foundation of all of our work be about making sure that mental health is for all.
All right, thanks, Amy. So we, this school year, are focusing on 4 key messages or themes for our Coaches Network meetings this year. These 4 key messages come from our interconnected systems framework, or the framework to help utilize PBIS and integrate school mental health into one merged system. And so these key messages, we want to just keep bringing to us to say, how can we utilize PBIS? How can we expand? How can we enhance what we're doing? And so the key message that we really feel like the staff wellness fits within today is mental health is for all. And so as a key message, that really, mental health is for all, speaks to the idea that we all need mental health. We all need mental wellness, students, staff, families. And this key message expands really on the idea that mental health, it includes social emotional competencies that we all need to interact and function successfully within our environments and to cope with stressors. So when we think of mental health in that way, our staff need those skills to be able to cope with the stress. And this is a key message that we don't necessarily have to sell very hard anymore, because in our current context, we have a lot of societal stressors happening. We have the pandemic, and the ever-changing world of education due to the pandemic. We also have lots of natural disasters happening around our world and our country with wildfires and hurricanes. We have a lot of social unrest that's causing trauma and stress for those in those areas where there's social unrest, as well as those who maybe have experienced that in their past, or it's prompting other stress for them. So this key message isn't necessarily a key message we have to sell very hard anymore, hence why all of you are on with us. But just expanding that idea that mental health is really for everyone in our school and in our school communities. So we have a quick poll. How many of you, and so Diane, I think is going to pull that up. Perfect. How many of you would say that mental health currently in your district includes all staff, students, and families? Yes, maybe you're on your way, or you're kind of working at that still. And we'd love to start inviting you to share any examples in chat as we keep going. So perfect. I think this is that piece where we aren't selling this message as much anymore. People, we're all realizing that educators are in very stressful roles, and how do we continue to support those needs? And so I'm glad to see a lot of us are on our way, are already including that in all. So thank you, Diane, for sharing those, or sharing that poll. And so as we continue, then we're going to think about, before we make any kind of action plan for anything that we're implementing or adding, we want to really resist the temptation to just add something new, right? Well, I know staff wellness is something that I'm hearing a lot about, so we got to do something about it. Yes, probably. And before we do make a plan, we really have to assess where are we at? Where's our current system? Where are our needs? And then design our plan, right? That's how we function and when we're implementing PBIS. We assess, we figure out our data, and then we define an action plan that's going to be really effective towards meeting our needs. So we want you to think kind of in two components here to get started with thinking about where's your current system. And so the individual staff wellness piece is really like, where are your staff at? Where's their satisfaction, their level of satisfaction with their current role as an educator? Amy mentioned, we're in helping professions, and with helping professions, most of us went into that because we have some sort of satisfaction that comes from being in a helping profession. The other end of that, though, is the fatigue that comes with that. We often think about that fatigue part that our educators are going through. If it's secondary trauma, if it's just the stress of do this today and tomorrow, here's our new plan, all of those pieces are stressful and cause educators to have that compassion fatigue. But we forget sometimes about the satisfaction component is there as well. So how are we supporting our educators to keep an focus on that satisfaction and identify that satisfaction that's happening? Do your staff know? Do they have the skills? Do they have those social emotional competencies to develop effective and efficient self-care plans? We often hear about self-care, but even as a school social worker, in my education, I was told I was going to need self-care, but no one really told me how to create a self-care plan. I've learned that more in the last few years about how to do that and what are the components of a strong self-care plan. So do your educators truly have the skills to develop a plan? The other component that we want you to think of, or kind of broader topic, is school climate. How connected do the staff feel to each other? Do they feel like they're there to support one another? Do they feel like they have someone they can go to? Remember, a key component for resiliency in our youth is that they can name an adult that they can rely on or they can go to, right? That's a key component of resiliency. What about that in adults? Do adults in our buildings have somebody that they can go to when they need support, when they need to say, I've had a hard day? Do they have somebody? We want that just like we do for youth, for the adults in our building. Do staff feel appreciated by the leaders in our building, by other staff, by students, by families? Do staff feel support from each other's care? So these are kinds of questions that we want to to have some data on so that we can know where we want to start in building our plan. So some ideas of how to assess those questions for the individual educator self-care, the professional quality of life scale, is a measure survey that helps look at the compassion satisfaction component I talked to, as well as the compassion fatigue. So that piece that we want to make sure that we're measuring and helping to know, is the satisfaction there and how's it balancing out with the fatigue? Probably never going to get an equal balance there, but we can, this professional quality of life scale helps us to weigh those components. So here's a screenshot of what that looks like in those questions. The link is here for you to be able to use this with your staff. And so that would be an individual, having individual educators complete the professional quality of life scale, and it comes out with aggregated scores in 3 areas, and maybe being able to submit those anonymously in aggregate scores so that you can have a baseline of this is where our staff is at in October of 2020, and be able to use that as a progress monitoring tool for what you've put in place. The next piece then would be, do staff understand what is self-care? So we might have to give them a little bit about what is self-care. So, the idea that self-care is responsible, that it's planned, that it's about in the moment strategies, as well as kind of long-term strategies that we can kind of keep as deposits to help us stay closer to that state of calm that Amy described. That self-care is individual to each of us and is different for all of us. That it's multiple domains that's going to really support our self-care and our regulation, and that we all need self-care. So some ideas of what our self-care and some strategies for especially those long-term strategies in this self-care wheel. We also really like the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's Compassion Resilience Guide, and they talk about self-care as this idea of compassion resilience, and that it's not just the self-care component, but it's also about having really realistic expectations, setting strong boundaries, and that staff culture piece, right? That connection, that feeling appreciated, connecting and having support from colleagues, and that self-care component. So do our staff have knowledge of what are these components and how to establish those? So to assess that, and do they really have a plan? So we might just have to ask our staff some questions, right? We might have to just get some, maybe it's in a quick Google form or it's at a staff meeting, but where are they at? Do they what's their perception of staff self-care? Do they have a plan for self-care? Are they implementing it? To what extent, right? These kinds of questions are going to help us to decide where do we begin to support staff with developing self-care plans. We don't want to start at a place that's either too high or too low for where they're at, right? So we can do some assessing. Later, we'll share the resources. Diane, if you want to open this poll, where do you think your staff currently are? And while you're responding to that poll, we'll share where there's some resources on our trauma content page. And there's a few short recordings of what are stress, what is self-care. Those might be helpful to, if you're needing to start with kind of defining stress and self-care for staff, those might be some options that are already developed for you. So it looks like a lot of us are at this point of they see self-care as being responsible. They all know they need it, but they maybe don't have the skills to really develop an effective plan. So again, this would be some data to get. Make sure this is your perception, this is your hunch. How could you formalize that? And then where are you going to begin? It's probably at that point going to be using maybe some of those recordings or doing some quick PD with your staff to help them develop those plans. Thanks for sharing those. Okay, I think that's sharing the results. I'm gonna stop sharing that. Sorry, now my cursor's gone. There we go. So the other component that we wanted to focus on was the school climate piece, right? How connected do our staff feel? Do they feel appreciated? Do they feel connected? Do they feel supportive? So the school climate survey for school personnel, some of you have maybe used the school climate survey with your students. There's also a staff or school personnel component. And so this could be a measure that you could use to help assess where your staff are at. Again, great baseline data. We want to know that what we put into place made an impact, right? And so we could use the school climate survey now and again later to help us with monitoring that. Maybe you use the full survey, maybe you pull a few questions, but either way it's available, the PDF version, and then you can also take it through your PBIS apps account. The other piece that you want to think about with your school climate is what implicit biases are currently happening within your building or your district around self-care. So think about what would be the majority of your staff's reaction to the principal saying, put all my calls on hold and no visitors for 20 minutes while I eat lunch. Would staff view that as responsible, or would they view that as being selfish? Would they view that as self-care, or do they view that as not being supportive? What would happen? What's the view if the teacher's eating at their desk and working at the same time? Do staff view that as responsible, or do they view that as maybe not a way to support their own self-care, right? So how could we start having these conversations? Could we have some real conversations? Where is it safe to have those conversations? Is it in a staff meeting? Do we do restorative circles with our staff? Could we have these conversations that way? Do we maybe do these in a smaller group like a PLC or a grade level meeting where we have some honest conversations, but start to uncover where do people feel like there's a judgment on them practicing their self-care? We have to remove those barriers to self-care before staff are going to feel honest about that. And so later in the practice section, we'll say we have to define the expectations for self-care, and we can align those with our school-wide expectations. So those, after we uncover the barriers and the implicit bias that might lie there, then we can define, so what is it? What do we want it to look like to support staff self-care? So we're going to give you guys a moment to to introduce yourselves in a small breakout room, and then discuss what are some possible steps that you might need to take to assess your staff self-care, or what have you already done to assess your current need, and where your starting point has been. So when you go into your room, introduce yourself, use some good social skills, and then give some ideas to what you've already done and where you might need to start, and identify somebody that can come back to share out a few ideas to the whole group.
Okay, I'm going to open the rooms a couple.
All right, so we just want to spend a couple of minutes. There were 7 breakout groups, and we just want 1 or 2 of you to share out some of your big ideas about how you start to assess need, or if you've already assessed needs. So if we can just have a couple people report out big ideas from your conversation.
Hi, my name is Faith. In my group, we spoke about kind of the need to start at putting out a survey to see kind of what teachers need as kind of like a baseline to figure out what types of self-care is needed, what types of things could people potentially offer, and just kind of seeing what people need first before planning a whole calendar for self-care.
Faith, such a great idea, right? Find out first, use your data to drive your decision making. It's great, great plan.
I can jump in.
ProQual can help with that. The ProQual can help with that.
I can jump in. I was in group 7. We didn't even really get to the prompt because we were introducing ourselves and we had a larger group. However, I would just echo the sentiment for the staff survey. In our district, we're working really hard to just encourage our building administrators to do regular check-ins and have their building leadership team kind of check in to kind of assess where the staff are each week. And so they have basically created short little Google surveys to see where everybody's at. And then if they want someone to circle back to them, and it's actually really amazing how many of our staff are checking that, like, yes, please come and check in with me. And it provides a really great opportunity for that personal connection when we're all so kind of isolated.
Awesome, great example. That's really says a lot about how it's working if they ask for the check-in, right? Thank you, Allison. If you have other ideas that you would like to share out, if you would put them in chat, then everybody will be able to see them and we'll be able to keep moving along here so that we make sure we have plenty of time for your second hour of TA. So we're going to go into talking now about applying the MTSS or multi-tiered logic to staff wellness. So somebody mentioned in the chat box, like, it's hard because teachers don't necessarily feel like they have the support or the structure to practice self-care. And that's really what we want to have in place, right? We don't want to throw Jello at the wall. We want to have a plan about what data we're going to use to drive our decisions, what practices we're going to put in place for our staff, and what systems we're going to put in place. So just as a reminder, when we're implementing PBIS or the MTSS framework, it's a process for continuous improvement, meaning it's never over, we're never done, we're always taking what we learn and improving on it. And it is also about aligning those initiatives. So I always say this as if somebody stops you in the grocery store and says, why do you do PBIS or MTSS? My answer to you, hopefully what would come out of your mouth would be something like, because we want to have kids who are socially, emotionally competent, can achieve academically, and thrive in an environment that's culturally equitable. So that's what we're really after at the end of the day. So this circle slide is about data systems and practices. And many of you have seen this a million times, but just as a reminder, we're going to use data to make culturally valid decisions where we are more than likely using some sort of universal screening and progress monitoring, and what we are checking out to see if we do what we say we're doing, which is the fidelity piece. And then the practices piece about supporting student behavior, and the systems about being able to making it so adults can do their job. So we're going to actually break this down, systems, data, and practices, all about staff wellness. So when we think about the systems piece of staff wellness, these are the pieces that you can think of. I'm going to get more specific here in a minute, but when you think about systems, you want to think about, do you have team-based leadership and coordination? And do you have administrator, both district and school administrator commitment and buy-in? So put your staff wellness lens on and think, do we have somebody leading that charge? Do we have support from our administration? What kind of professional development and coaching and performance feedback do we want to give people about staff wellness? How are we going to support staff in their effort to implement self-care? How are we going to get communication from all of our stakeholders? And how are we going to document this in some sort of policy format? So here are a couple of things to consider. So what team could you have to lead and coordinate this work? We would suggest, of course, you consider a team that's already in place addressing school-wide climate and culture. So your tier 1 team, your universal team, your building leadership team. We don't want you to have, just like we would say, don't have a restorative team and a trauma team and a PBIS team. The same would be here. Don't start a new team. Let's look at what we have and where this can fit. so that you're not creating something new and shiny, but you're just building and using that continuous process of improvement. Could it be that you have policies in place to support self-care? So for instance, we don't have any meetings on Tuesdays. That's how we're going to help support staff self-care. A tap in, tap out system. So for example, if I'm a classroom teacher and Katie's a classroom teacher, and I see that Katie's about to blow her gasket, we'd have a tap in, tap out setting. So it's not in a shaming way, but I could, if our code word is phone call, I could say, Katie, I have a phone call in the office, I'll step in for you. And that's the tap in, tap out system. So that could be me giving Katie suggestion to tap out, but it could also just be Katie saying, hey, I have to go make a phone call. Can you step in? So that you have a tap in, tap out system set up where people can feel supported in that we're all human. This is ridiculously hard with COVID. It was hard before COVID, but it's so much harder now. Do we have an environment where Katie can say, Amy, I need to take a phone call. Can you step in for me? Because Katie doesn't feel like she's going to stay regulated. Could you have some things like walking meetings? Could you do things like a stop doing professional development goal? Like we're going to stop venting in the lunchroom. We're going to stop talking about kids and families in the lunchroom. We're going to stop reading and sending pointless emails. Like, could you start to think about things based on your data where you could set up some systems that would be helpful? So another example would be having a self-care manual where you have defined self-care. You've clearly laid out why it's important. You have resources and tips, and you have a way to encourage people in a written format why self-care is important. So we have a district in Indiana that puts self-care. One of the responsibilities of all staff in this district was to practice self-care. And then they listed it out in their handbook because they wanted, their superintendent wanted everybody to know he was on board with this and this is how we did business. And you can see here this example of how offering those manuals has been shown in that example to be really useful and help staff. So you could do staff reminders. Somebody put this in the chat box, weekly emails like take care of yourself Tuesday, wellness Wednesday. You could post tidbits, places like the staff bathroom, the staff lounge in memos or newsletters. So we're just trying to continuously create a system that keeps staff wellness in the conversation, basically. It's going to be what's going to support all the grown-ups' work. So we could also have staff reminders about information that we've taught them, like reminders about boundaries, reminders about what the signs of compassion fatigue are. You could have staff professional development. So you could create staff circles where you're going to define the culture. Your staff defines the culture that they want to live and work in. And you would establish boundaries, expectations. You could also do professional development around direct instructional topics like what is self-care and why do we do it? I mentioned in the chat box, we in our content, we break down in the moment strategies for self-care and long-term strategies for self-care. So that's just how we categorize it. But we know that long-term self-care, like doing meditation practice, helps build your resiliency over time. But in the moment, what are you going to do in the moment when a student is frustrated for you? What are you going to do in the moment when you feel super stressed out? What are you going to do in the moment before you start class? So in the moment strategies are those things that don't take a ton of time. We're going to actually put some examples of that in our newsletter that's coming out soon. So we have resources for you. I put this link in the chat box when Katie was talking. Defining stress. It's a short recording intended for you to be able to share with your staff, along with the PowerPoint around self-care, some handouts and other information for you that you could look at. So the practices, so that was the systems. What are we going to do to support the implementation of staff self-care? And then the practices, how are we going to get practices in place that are going to match what our staff need? How are we going to put things in place with fidelity? Meaning, are we doing what we say we are doing? And how are we going to make sure that what we're doing is going to result in some sort of outcomes? So as a reminder, when we're doing that, we're looking at tier 1 is something we do for everyone, tier 2 is something we do for some, and tier 3 is something we do for few. So when you look at that in a triangle like this, you see an example of our continuum of supports for students could include things like having expectations for self-care defined, and they're aligned to our be safe, be responsible, be respectful. We could help all staff members have self-care plans. We could have all meetings begin with things like a wellness check. We could do that for everyone. And then we could have some small groups that are about self-care or wellness. I know when I worked in alternative school, we had a small group of people that did meditation at the end of every day. And so that became supported by the administration. That was just a small group of people who did that. And then the few people were talking about employee assistance programs and having self-care coaching, which somebody mentioned earlier. Allison mentioned earlier, kind of people being able to ask for somebody to check in with them. Somebody also mentioned EAP programs in the chat box, and that's a great thing. And that's for really just a few, probably the more intensive version of support that you're giving people. As a side note, make sure that your people, when you talk about self-care, actually understand that your EAP program, what that looks like, whether or not administrators are told if they go, and how often they go. Make sure that you have all that ironed out and clear and ready to present to your staff. So we've been in positions where we say EAP program and a room full of 70 people say, I don't know what that is. So sometimes we just need to do a little bit of a better job advertising and educating. So when we look at how we're going to line up those school-wide expectations, just like when you do tier 2 PBIS implementation, you want to make sure that all roads connect back to tier 1. And so you can see how we've tied those pieces to the tier 1 expectations. So to be safe, it means we're going to ask for time to regulate. To be responsible, we're going to establish boundaries. To be respectful, we're going to recognize other self-care practices. So when somebody leaves it right on time to go to spin class, instead of the judgy voice in your head, it's the, hey, great way to practice self-care. You could have routines and team meetings where you start with all team meetings with a wellness check. So for example, what's the most generous act you've seen recently? What's giving you hope? What's the best thing that happened to you today? So you could just begin to set up routines and procedures that are woven in as opposed to separate. So in this section, self-care and practices, what I hope you heard is we need ways to structure this so it's just part of how we do business. And the practices are we need to have things in place that we do routinely and regularly in order to make this work. I'm going to go through the data section, which is just a couple of slides, and then we're going to put you back in your rooms where you're going to have some time to talk a little bit more. So when you're talking about data, somebody mentioned this earlier, when we use this circle with PBIS implementation, what we're really talking about is, are we using some sort of screening for internalizing and externalizing needs? So how are you going to start thinking about that with staff wellness? And somebody already mentioned doing a survey. How are you going to decide what practices to put in place? That should, of course, be driven by your data. So you don't want to put a meditation kind of practice after school in place if your data says really what people need is more time to grade papers, right? You're not going to want to take up their time if that's really what they need. So how are you going to make team-based decision make? How are you going to use your team to make decisions? How are you going to continue to look at this in an ongoing fashion? How are you going to set up your continuum so that all interventions and practices are layered? And how are you going to look to see if you're doing what you actually say you're going to do? Which takes us back to the slide Katie showed earlier. How are you going to monitor staff's level of satisfaction with their job? Are you going to measure compassion fatigue and burnout? How do you know people actually have a self-care plan? And then asking and monitoring the climate information, data around how people feel connected to one another, whether they feel appreciated, and whether they feel supported by other people. So just like everything else with implementation, you want to make sure that there's data involved that looks at outcomes for staff and outcomes for students. So this staff outcomes could be around the pro-qual. It could be a climate survey. You could begin looking at staff attendance, and staff attendance would be Important to remember that sometimes when you start talking about self-care, people start using their sick time, which is how they're performing self-care, right? They're staying home when they're sick. That's actually a great self-care practice, right? So your attendance data might not be the right thing to look at because it actually might go down. So you just kind of want to know what you're looking at. And then student outcomes, the things that we would consider looking at would be how many crisis calls are happening, how many restraints are happening, what are our academics looking like, and could we have students and families fill out some school climate surveys? All right, so Katie, I'm going to toss this back to you.
So Amy, our timing is maybe a bit off today, and I'm getting lots of chats about signing off at 3. So I think instead of another breakout room, we're actually going to do a little bit of sharing out. If you want to come off mute or share in chat, what are some things that you maybe have put into place? And is it for supports for all, some, or few of your staff? So if anyone, will invite you to come off mute instead of going into breakout rooms for now.
Oh, yes. Can you guys hear me? I'm sorry. My speakers have been working very well. One of the things that we started actually last year in our district is we started to have some self-care sessions where we offered yoga. We had some meditative kinds of things. They were offered after school. We had a pretty good turnout for that. Then of course in March, it all came to a screeching halt. And we're trying to start to put some of that back into place this year. This year, we're also offering some trauma presentations. And in those trauma presentations, we are including, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and then things that we can do for self-care. We also will be offering professional development, an actual course around adult self-care. So we're really trying to put some things in place, but we have a long way to go to try to establish something more.
Thanks, Kathy. So some direct skill teaching around some self-care strategies, as well as I've heard of a few districts starting to do some adult social emotional competencies, self-care kind of professional development, and even offering professional development hours or credits for that kind of PD, which is always a good incentive there. Other ideas that people have already started?
This is one that we can't take credit for, but if those of you who are on the call are familiar with Second Step, they are actually, they have the SEL for Adults Resilience and Crisis module, and it's really awesome. It's free through the end of December. And so we've shared that out pretty widely with our district staff as a resource. It has 3 units. There are some student resources within it, and they're like little micro learnings that you can complete in 5 to 10 minutes. And it also allows you to kind of save your reflection. So you can just find it with a little Google search. It's really pretty great. And we've had a lot of positive feedback from sharing that out.
Thanks, Allison, it's always great to know when somebody has used something that maybe you've seen and have some real experience there. So I appreciate you sharing that. And Jennifer sharing a chat about the Practicing Presence book. That's where our staff really started with developing our curriculum around self-care, is Practicing Present by Lisa Lucas. It's an easy read and we think a great book for a book study. So. How many of you would say you have self-care expectations defined as a staff? You can give me like a thumbs up for those of you I see on video. Not too many, right? Okay. So maybe share in chat as I give us the final section here. Share in chat, what is one idea that you're taking away around a practice in that all summer few that you might want to be considering to put into place into a continuum of supports? Where might you start, or what might you add to what you're already doing? So if you want to share in chat an action step. And I'm going to share my screen and give us some ideas around, remember on our Coaches Network meetings, all are welcome. And we also want to, our content is focused on being able to take this back and coach this to all of your staff in your district or your building. So we want to give you some ideas as a coach. Your role is to help understand the content and support the implementation, right? We know that we can't just say, here's what self-care is and here's some strategies. We have to support staff to utilize the plans that they develop and put those into place. So just like if we're training on a classroom practice, we couldn't just stop with here's what it is. We'd have to provide some ongoing support if we really want that to that practice to be implemented in the classroom. So same thing with self-care. We can't just stop with we've told our staff what self-care is and how to develop a plan, but we have to support them. So embedding those self-care reminders and tips within our self-care, within our communications, right? If our administrator sends out a newsletter, how can we make sure that there's always something about self-care? If we send out even our family newsletters, how can we embed that in? So any of our regular communications, can we embed things in? The take care of yourself Tuesdays or wellness Wednesdays, whatever day works best, right? Are great ways of reminding staff and keeping it at the forefront that this is important for all of us. Can we create some self-care challenges among staff and using like self-care bingo or a 7-day self-care challenge, and staff, completing those and turning it in for an acknowledgement, but just some fun, right? Keeps it at the forefront for us. Maybe we send a Friday email to connect us. So share something that you're grateful for. What brought you satisfaction this week? So just get a prompt going and inviting others to respond and share. Our team is small at Midwest, but we do that often. And that's that part of that climate, right? We want to make sure that we're connecting and we're supporting one another, that our staff feel like we're a group together, or a community, right? So even those kind of prompting emails are great ways to connect with one another. We could offer virtual or in-person staff check-ins, depending on what mode of learning we're in. Can we offer prompts to use in our small groups? So maybe those staff wellness check-ins, do we always, as the coach, do I give a weekly prompt that they can use in their PLC or their grade level meeting to check in with one another? It could be similar to those, what are you grateful for? What brought you satisfaction this week? What's one thing that's giving you hope? Or one thing that's, what's something that you saw growth in a student this week, right? But you're focused on those satisfaction components of our profession. And for a few, can we offer to be a self-care coach? Are there some in your building that might offer to be a self-care coach? It doesn't always have to be you, but somebody that would sign up and say, yeah, I would help someone else along their self-care journey. It's something I've really excelled at in the last year or two, and I would help somebody else, right? Could you share your self-care journey with others? I did some work in a district with all their staff, and their administrators stood up and shared their journey around what self-care looked like for them. And sometimes that can be really helpful, right? So it might not be to everybody, but it could be to a few of our staff to really support them. So think about what the ongoing coaching might look like for self-care. And that might be for your role, but also bringing maybe others along to help with that, that supporting of self-care. During COVID, back in the spring, we did develop this supporting staff self-care and some ideas for distal support. So this document is just a quick, some of those ideas were just shared on that last slide, but might be helpful. So as we wrap up for this hour, so this month we are starting our new structure, and our hope is that we end this topic-based content and sharing section and go into some breakout rooms that will allow you to get some more targeted technical assistance and opportunity for networking and sharing with others who are on this call. And so we'll take a 5-minute break here in a few minutes. And after the break, we'll go into breakout rooms, and you can choose if you want to stay in, come back and go into a room that we talk more about staff wellness. So we can dig in further into sharing some ideas and examples and giving some technical assistance. You could go into a room about tier 1, and maybe you have some barriers or some things that are getting in the way at tier 1, or you want to talk more about the ideas that we shared in August around tier 1 and distal support, or tier 2. So we have 3 breakout rooms: tier 1, tier 2, or staff wellness. And what we're asking you to do is, before break, rename yourself by putting which breakout room you would like to go to: tier 1, tier 2, or staff wellness. So to do that, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you should have the participant icon, and that should pull up the participant list of everyone who's on the call. And then you'll find your name and should be able to right click and rename and add tier 1, tier 2, or staff wellness. You might also be able to do it from your picture with the 3 little dots. If you click on that, you might have the option to rename. So if you do that before break, the other opportunity is, we know some people want to work with their teams. So if you aren't going to stay on, that's fine. You'll just sign out. You can go work with your team, or you have heard the content for today. So your choice. But if you're staying in, please rename yourself, and we'll take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we'll have the breakout rooms set up. While you're on break, think about what your burning questions are. What would you like the topic to be while we're in that room? And that will help us you guys will be organizing the agenda of conversation. Diane, Trisha, what else do I need to help us set up for?
I think that's it. Just mainly, before you take your break,